Hello. Hello and welcome to Portraits of Greatness, Ep.6. We're on Michel de Montaigne, or Montaigne, as some of the Americans call him, or the skeptic, more broadly, as Emerson wants to tackle the theme of the skeptic. How are you, Rashid, this week?
Yeah, I'm Rashid this week, as I've been Rashid all throughout 5 other weeks that came before this. And yeah, this week we're going to be talking about the very little known philosopher known as Montaigne. And, as you know, we talked last week about the worldwide famous Swedenborg. So it's going to be a good contrast compared to who we're going to talk about this week. I'm pretty sure no one has even heard of this guy, right, John?
Oh yeah, I'd never heard of him before this, of course. No, it's of course quite a famous essayist. Probably his collections of essays are probably one of the most well-known and comprehensive in terms of themes. Even if you just quickly look up Michel de Montaigne's Wikipedia page, a direct influence on writers including Francis Bacon, Descartes, Pascal, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Gibbon, Virginia Woolf, William Hazlitt, John Henry Newman, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, Friedrich Nietzsche, and on it goes. So, yes, quite an influential, quite a well-known character. Very different to Swedenborg, and still broadly studied in undergraduate courses today, I believe.
I think he is counted as one of the inventors, right, of this sort of what essays turned out to be.
Very much a Renaissance humanist, very much a Renaissance skeptic as well. So you had some opening paragraphs you thought would set the scene as Emerson wants to paint it. Do you think that's a good
because
where you can jump off
he's talking about skepticism, and he wants to sort of explain how he views skepticism to be. And this is where I believe Emerson sort of diverges from how we view skepticism in contemporary life. For instance, when I think of a skeptic, and I'll ask you what you think of a skeptic as well. When I think of a skeptic, I think of someone who is always like denying the reality of something, or just just questioning everything. For instance, when I think of a skeptic, I think of someone who thinks like, do I know what I know, or do I think I know what I know? Or some of that sort of, I don't know anything. And this sort of thought does resonate within Michel de Montaigne as well. I believe while he was in his deathbed, he said, I don't know anything, or something alongside those lines. But I think of someone kind of like how Emerson showcases a cynic here. Someone who's like, well, these things aren't important because you can never know if they are important. How do you know if wealth or money or like food are important when life isn't really worth anything? That's how I kind of have this tendency to view a skeptic. And that's not how Emerson views a skeptic here. And I think that's not how philosophy majors view skeptics as well, because I've heard of a few people that were like talking about skepticism in a more positive manner towards life. They're talking about skepticism having a more positive attitude toward life, whereas a cynic would just say, as they do in this essay, men are just animals and so forth. So life doesn't even worth anything. You come in and you go. And
a cynic wouldn't even write the essays of Montaigne because he'd say, "What's the point?" Yeah. No, I understand that. There's a great want, I think, in the humanities to have themselves viewed as skeptics as well, because it means that they're without biases, and that is a loaded term today. But let's talk about like biases as in the nature of, I'm not going to side with a certain dogma over another. That's what I mean. Not these sort of inherent biases, and you need to be reprogrammed the way the humanities want to do it nowadays, but an actual bias. So he's a great ideal in that sense, that you can look to Montaigne and he writes. Now, there's a fault to it. We can come into it later that I have with it, but the fact that he can choose to write about anything, and he's so well learned, he can reference all of these different classical attributes. I think he had, read Plutarch through a recent Renaissance translation by Jacques Amiot. So he was aware of the great man theory. If we want to sort of bring in Montaigne's interaction with that, Plutarch plays a large part in Montaigne's sculpting and essays, and he likes picking out little parts of their lives as he's just trying to have anecdote. But it's never to kind of construct a moralistic point of view. It is always sort of just to probe around the great immensity of everything. Like the more Montaigne
explore
knew,
with an open
the less
mind,
he knew.
as Emerson puts it.
Yeah.
So and he's at the beginning paragraph. He's talking about what exactly is a skeptic and how does he sort of diverge himself from the common people and with their common thoughts. And what he starts with is interesting because he doesn't just start with talking about skepticism. He talks about how people come about with their thoughts, and he categorizes all people in like two categories. He categorizes one as being someone who is interested in their sensations, and the other in exploring moral values. And the way he goes about this is he gives a sort of an example. He says, a guy going through life, for instance, he has, a job, he has a livelihood, he's raising a family, he's taking care to pay his taxes, and he's going through life in some level of comfort. But then one day he stops like working, he stops like living the usual mundane existence he's living, and then he thinks, why am I doing this and where am I going here? The exact quote in which he talks about this is, I believe I can read it here. A man is flushed with success and bethinks himself what this good luck signifies. He drives his bargain in the street, but it occurs that he also is bought and sold. He sees the beauty of a human face and searches the cause of that beauty, which must be more beautiful. He builds his fortunes, maintains the laws, cherishes his children. But he asks himself, why? And where to? So he makes this distinction. This is how people sort of go from how people set their identities as someone who is within the world of sensation or as opposed to the world of moral values. And he categorizes them by saying people have these inherent proclivity towards one side. He says that some people are more likely to join the sensation party or the moral values party. And the way he categorizes those two different parties is very kind of complex in the way he does it, because he's basically throwing all of humanity into two camps. And he introduces the third camp as the camp that he's going to talk about within the essay. But he basically throws all of humanity in it. So the sensationalist, they don't just mean someone who's like interested in, bodily strength or like sex, as you would think of in sensations. He also puts in people who are interested in material wealth. He also talks about people within that category as people who seek health of body, strength of body, wealth, and tangible goods, for instance. He puts them all within the sensation party, and then he puts the other moral values, not just people who are like priests or the people you usually associate with moral values, but he also puts in philosophers, he puts in writers, he puts in thinkers,
poets,
and and the artists, the painters or the sort of sculptors, they're kind of in this weird spot. He's more likely to put them in the sensations category, which is interesting, which I found interesting, to be honest. He's putting the sculptors and the painters in the sensations category, even though he could sort of make this argument that they're actually in the other.
He's probably thinking of the Pygmalion type, where they almost want the statue to come to life. Therefore, they're kind of more overcome with those.
Not so.
They'll try to come they're more overawed by the sensations. They're working with the material, whereas the poet, though, he's working with ink. Like, he's not obsessed with ink the same way that a sculptor will be obsessed with the stone or whatever, marble or whatever he's sculpting with.
Yeah, and he actually does. He doesn't just start talking about these two lines as being wrong or right. He says that these two lines exist, these two places, and in the middle is not in the middle, but more likely separate from them is the skeptics who don't adhere to either of
They
them.
would like to picture themselves above it.
Yeah, basically these two parts and the skeptic right here.
Yeah.
So he says that the skeptics, on the other hand, do not adhere to either of them and have an appropriate answer for each. He says that, skeptics believe that you cannot explain, explain reality just through material rationalizations. You can't explain reality just from looking at the material world. And they also say that to the moral values and the priests and the mystics, they tell them that you also can't exactly know the divine nature, because the divine path, or like the divine nature, is unknowable by design. It's not something you can put on words or just sort of live out. And this I found a bit interesting because it kind of reminded me a bit of Taoism. I've been kind of talking about Chinese culture from now and again when I see like parallels.
But rattling around your mind at the moment, is it?
Yeah, it's kind of going through. But I think there are good comparisons we can make them. For instance, in Taoism, which is the closest thing to what Emerson talks about skepticism, in my opinion, in how someone goes through their life, in which in Taoism you do not, you go through life and you do your social obligations, but you never think of your social sincerity as something, you see everything as like simply acting. And Montaigne in this essay talks about, whatever I do, as in like getting married or running for office, I did it out of necessity. I went with the flow of things, sort of. So in Taoism, that's also a big part of their religion. But also the most well-known quote of Taoism is this: Tao that can be told is not the true Tao, which reminds me of what the skeptics say here, as in the divine nature is unknowable by design, so you cannot put it in words. Which is kind of interesting, because then the book Tao Te Ching, which is the main book of Taoism, goes on to talk about Taoism for 500,000 words. But that duality is like, we can talk about that some other day, not here. But that reminded me of that sort of idea that I don't subscribe to anything, even though I live within the material world and have to provide for myself within the material world. That's not enough to explain it. But the divine nature is also not to be subscribed wholly, because it is unknowable by design. And the best thing you can do is just to live out your own existence. So in that sense, that's how Emerson sort of categorizes the skeptics as people who don't, people who are interested in using their own logic to deal with both sides of the aisle, not just believe a dogma and just go with, just be inflexible within their beliefs as to it, and just live through life believing exactly in the same things you believed yesterday. So Emerson distinguishes skeptics in that sense, and this is interesting. He says of the first two lines, that of moral values and that of sensation, he puts the people, Emerson makes a distinction between the unbeliever by calling him a man of action and talent, which is interesting. The unbeliever, the people of sensation, are people of action and talent in Emerson's view. And the people that believe are what you would call a genius, such as Plato, in Emerson's view. And he goes,
I found difficulty with that. No.
Okay,
The man
we'll
of
talk
action
about
has
that as soon as
first of all, complete and utter belief in himself, and his will that he's going to impose on whatever he's acting upon. There's a task to be done, and he has absolute belief. I don't. Maybe like he's thinking that the belief doesn't need to be something that is sat back and studied at as from a methodological point of view. You know, it can be something that is instinctive as well. So I really didn't get that.
Well, he actually explains these within these two quotes that I'm going to give. The first quote is about how he thinks man of sensation views the world. And he doesn't just start to just pillage these people yet. He's actually giving sort of good explanations of what they think. And in this sense, the people of sensation, hot life is streaming in a single direction. To the man of this world, to the animal's strength and spirits, to the men of practical power, just note the word practical there, whilst immersed in it, the man of ideas appears out of his reason. They alone have reason. So within a person of sensation, since they live within this world and just build it with their own hands, just a person contemplating making his identity out of contemplating the world seems out of his reason, because the reasonable thing to do is to just embrace the material nature of the world, provide for yourself and people related to you, and just go through your day. It's unreasonable. And for the people of learning, the things that they can think of in the abstract sense, and that they can sort of verbalize within language, they feel that the common man can't match up to it. Therefore, the thinker believes that the only way to go forward is with their own thoughts, because with men of action, you cannot achieve that moral superiority and moral perfection as you can with the men of thought. And he gives examples with writers such as, he says, I believe, within the correspondence of Jonathan Swift, the writer of Gulliver's Travels, and Alexander Pope, the translator of Iliad. He says that within their correspondence, they're almost talking about common man as animals and monsters. And if you read Gulliver's Travels, that's sort of that's also kind of like that, because it's a big satire, magnum opus. It's one of the most well-known satire books of all time. But yeah, he's talking about how the intellectuals view, the people of thought view people of action. And as we just talked about, the men of action view the intellectuals as out of reason. For instance, he says that both of them are scorned, and he actually gives this wonderful little tale. I don't know if you remember it, of Alexander Pope's nephew reacting to one of Alexander Pope's esteemed meeting one of Alexander Pope's esteemed friends. The story goes like this. And in this, he's talking about the scorn both sides feel towards each other, the intellectuals and the sort of men of thoughts and moral values feel scorn towards the men of sensation, and how the sensation people feel scorn towards the other. He's talking about, the tale is this. Spence relates that Mr. Pope, Alexander Pope, was with Sir Godfrey Kneller one day, when his nephew, a guinea trader, came in. "Nephew," said Sir Godfrey, "you have the honor of seeing two greatest men in the world." And the nephew says, "I don't know how great men you may be," said the guinea man, "but I don't like your looks. I have often bought a man much better than both of you, all muscles and bones, for 10 guineas. Thus the men of the senses revenge themselves on the professors and repay scorn for scorn. So in that sense, he says, like, well, you guys aren't like exactly. He says, I don't know who Godfrey Kneller is, but apparently he's a fan of Pope, and he says like you're looking at the two greatest men in the world, which is very pompous. He's putting himself in there as well. And then the Nephi just says you guys aren't like fit, muscular, or especially handsome, so I can buy slaves that look better than you, that have more uses than you, for instance.
Yeah.
It has sort of that subtext to it as well, which is hilarious in my opinion. So yeah, he's talking about those two polarizing views.
That dialectic, I mean, the sensations against the morals. We'll bring in Montaigne in a second. That dialectic for me, I think he was going for something like Platonic. He even mentions allusions to Plato when he says, "Beauty must have yet a cause for something more beautiful." I think he was thinking about the people of sensations there, and that struck me as twofold, both Platonic and then Faustian. Because you're trying to search for the infinite, there must be another layer beneath this. You're never satisfied with what's around you. But I think he takes that Platonic thing. I don't think it works. The men of action are the men of morals in this case. I think you definitely have a great crossover between the two. Where does he put Byron in this? He did mention Byron by name, but where does he fit in? This is somebody who was a poet, but he is not. He's completely a man of action of the world. And these are the sort of people that Carlyle dealt with, were people who transgressed this dialectic, not in the skeptical manner that Montaigne is going to bring us into here.
About Byron, I haven't read Byron himself. I kind of know a little bit about him, but I haven't read Byron himself. But I do know from reading Emerson's biography that Emerson was definitely not a fan of Byron. He used to be. It's kind of like your childhood show that you watch when you're a kid and you love it, and then later on you think like, oh my God, I actually went and watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles every weekend or something like that. So you go like, that was kind of what Byron was for Emerson. Emerson viewed him as, oh, he's amazing. He talks in this extremely nice prose and his words are just so inspirational when he was little. And when he grew up, he started viewing Byron as this sort of pompous douchebag, in a sense.
Yeah, well, he was a pompous douchebag, but also it's weird. That's the thing. You can't square. Emerson doesn't seem to be able to square that the two things existed within the one man. He was a pompous douchebag, but the first feelings also existed, and that's why I don't get this dialectic, because both of them exist within a person. It's perfectly capable. Now, you need to be quite a great person to achieve greatness in both ends, but you can be both an intellectual and a man of action. I don't think they're at odds with each other.
I think he's going to go into that distinction when he's talking about going out of skepticism, which we'll talk about as soon as we go into.
So let's enter Montaigne. Because for me, this is how I read him. Emerson sculpting his way into Montaigne. He has sensations and morals, and then above them, like both of those occur to Emerson in an hour-to-hour basis. Like time was quite important. Your sensations and your morals are things which you keep in check or drive you on a smaller time frame than that of the skeptic, who tries to say, keep it cool, it'll all be 100 years hence, was a quote he had, where it's like, you can then look back at from far away. But when you do so, the skeptic falls into the plant. What am I then in the context of this? Because once you move away from the hour-to-hour check, you move away from the sensation and moral dialectic, you can fall into a pit of skepticism. That's how I view it, having read through it, that you become so removed from it that you begin to question what you yourself are. And when he talks about Montaigne started to do this crucially when he inherits his father's estate in his 30s, is when he starts collecting the essays, because he has the time to do so. Before that in his life, he grew up, he went to one of the most prestigious schools in Bordeaux and was like part of the acting, the dramatists there, and he played key parts in performing sort of Italian opera repasts and this sort of stuff. So he was quite active, and then he inherits the estate and becomes quite reclusive in his study. And that's when Montaigne spins out the essays. That's when he begins to become skeptical, because he is now removed from the day-to-day. And what I thought was, as a skeptic, the reason Montaigne can do that and write these essays is because he inherits the estate. He's still his domain is not his own mind, which he thinks. He becomes obsessed with himself as isolated from the two dialectics. But actually, and he thinks que sais-je is something that Emerson keeps saying in relation to Montaigne, as if something Montaigne himself keeps repeating to himself. But I think he's wrong. Montaigne didn't get the only reason he entered that state was because he inherited the vineyard. His domain is still the vineyard. It's not his own mind. Isn't where he sculpts the world. If he doesn't inherit the vineyard, he's got no place to become the skeptic. So the skeptic still does fit in the world. He's not removed from it. That was kind of what I was taking from it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I do not remember Emerson mentioning. I don't know how you know it. You probably read it somewhere, reliable. I'm not saying you don't. That's not true. Probably, yeah, what you said is true. With Montaigne having this wealth given to him, just inheriting it. Although I don't know how much of the wealth he actually got from his own job until that point, because he was like 38, I believe. But Emerson definitely does sort of like just hoop over the whole Montaigne's inherited wealth thing. I didn't get that point at all from reading the essay. I know
it from reading Gilbert Hyatt, Classical Tradition. Sorry.
Oh.
And also the introduction it's all in the introduction to Montaigne's own essays as well. This guy.
Maybe we'll get to that.
People want to read this light reading. You'll read that in the weekend, probably.
Right next to the incredibly thin biography of Emerson, just like he wanted it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in fact, yeah, I got it. I got that. And I understand I wouldn't call it grievances, but your sort of confusion towards Emerson, because Emerson definitely does sort of skip over certain facts about a person's life to make sure that he's on point. And in this sense, I believe he skipped over the whole Montaigne's inherited wealth and the sort of freedom it gave him in order to talk about Montaigne's virtues. What my opinion lies is that even if Emerson sort of skipped over that, and if you're sort of a person of pragmatic thinking, you would think that this is kind of unfair, because Emerson's sort of touting skepticism as somewhat of a valid point of thinking to be in. You might feel that it is unfair, but in my opinion, what Emerson is talking about when he's going into Montaigne and what he thinks Montaigne signifies it to be, he's talking about the type of skepticism that someone who is engaged with the world, engaged with the earth, because he gives examples such as Montaigne raising his garden to be very cultivating and giving out fruits, such as, and he mentions
it's because he ran a vineyard. It was a business.
Yeah, he ran a vineyard, and now he's a absolute. He's just down to earth as any farmer or peasant. How dare you?
It was a business operation. It was his estate.
Yeah, but he gives out examples such as, he was okay with socializing with people. He was okay with, he was okay with running law beforehand. Yeah. So he
he quits the law as well. Yeah, he has a career in law.
He quits the law, but he had a career beforehand. So how Emerson writes it, you think that Montaigne had garnered this wealth and had lived with people and had just had started out his thought just when he was working and he was living within the world, and then he materialized them as skepticism when he was writing his essays. That's how you go about it when you're reading it without the biographical knowledge, just like you do. I can tell that because that's how I felt reading it. So in that sense, what Emerson is saying sort of is this, that a person such as a skeptic, first of all, has to live within the world and has to provide for themselves within the world, just to be sort of not genuine, but more like an authentic person, for us to understand that his words are worth listening. Because if he's just a bum, or someone who is, like you said, depending on his father's money, then you wouldn't exactly view them as someone worth listening to, as opposed to like taking advice or like sort of altering your own thought, as opposed to according to what you're reading. So in that sense, it does not give that notion when you think of his father's money, but when you just think of what Emerson says, with him raising his vineyards, with him dealing with people, with him being genuine in his writings, it does give the sense of someone who is down to earth, who provides for themselves, and who is not willing to subscribe to both modes of thought because they view it as too extreme. And, they see the extremes that are living around him, such as people who are either too much into wealth, like followers of Ayn Rand, for instance. Obviously, there were no followers of Ayn Rand back then, but it's kind of this objectivist mentality of just think of yourself, because that's the best way to go about it in business. And on the other side, in still materialism, you have the people that are also like saying it's all worth nothing, because in the end, like you're gonna come in, which is interesting because he puts cynics, which you would think of like in moral values, somewhere in both sensation and the moral values almost, because he's talking about the cynics as the people who are on the extreme side of materialism, with saying, we're all animals. In the end, even if you get wealth, which is unlikely, you will lose it in the end. You will die, and you will come into the world just like you came out of it, and you will not make a dent within anything, because everything is pointless. In this sort of cynic way of thinking of material world, and he puts those, the skeptic sees these extremes, and also within the extreme of the moral values, with people shutting in convents, or people completely disengaging with the world because it's not the ideal version that they want it to be. He views, dogmatizers, the people who just think one way and just will not budge even if every evidence goes up against it. And he has a wonderful little line there. He says that if you don't have any proof for eternal life, but just wish it were so, then why don't you just say it? Why don't you just say, I believe in God because I wish I could live forever, but I don't really have any proof? Why are you telling me that, you're going to live forever? You're not. You don't know that. He has that sort of, he's clarifying what a skeptic would view in that sort of situation, which is a skeptic would just question everything these people have, especially on the extreme side, in which in my opinion, almost everyone has that sort of extreme side to some part of their belief, which can be questioned, and which some might argue that should be questioned. For instance, postmoderns. Just to give a contemporary example of that.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Ayn Rand there, and this idea of the self being too much an extreme in one end. The problem I have with the skeptic is they are also quite selfish in the same regard, because now you can bring this back to Montaigne, because he has his wealth of classical knowledge. You can say he gets imbued with that, the Delphic oracle. Is that mentioned in Emerson? I read it somewhere, I can't remember. Know thyself. So Montaigne reads about this Delphic oracle, know thyself, and then he kind of takes that as his own maxim. The whole essays are written about him, and he makes no doesn't try and hold back from that. He's happy to say it's just about him, as well as kind of random musings. It's kind of like, I have collected this extraordinary wealth of knowledge, and now I'm just gonna.
He sort of comes off as a YouTube blogger at times.
It's all over. It's all over the place. But I think, at the heart of it maybe is that Delphic oracle, because he is very classical, and you have to give him his credit for that. he's an extraordinarily well-learned person, especially for the time. Some of the translations he managed to get his hands on so early into the the Renaissance translations, these classics, is astounding. But yeah, the know thyself, I think it goes too far, because the essays I think Emerson does actually say this. The essays become a soliloquy, very much a work of self-description. And then you see also he loves Socrates in them, though I think even he will find faults in parts of Socrates, because he doesn't want to just become worship, because you have to remain the skeptical throughout, even skeptical.
Yeah, he only mentions that in
skeptic.
passing, though, like the whole Socrates. I didn't get anything out of it. He just sort of he always has I think he's talking about how mundane the writing style of it is. He's just
but he'll love
as if he's talking.
Socrates is the constant question.
But and then he goes into, but he revered Socrates above all else, and after that he just starts.
But because he's the person who would question everything and pretend the only thing I know is that I know nothing, is Socrates' line. So Montaigne would have found, a great belief in that. So the skeptic still has to believe in something. That's my whole issue with this.
Skeptics still have to believe in something. That's your whole issue.
They're stuck in their own dogmas. The skepticism itself becomes a dogma, because and it can lead to stuff like postmodernism, is what you're talking about. It can lead to this want to just take down and dismantle anything that they see to have any destruction or any construction in it, be it in terms of people's daily lives or physical destructions in the way the architecture goes on these days.
Yeah, but skepticism turns into cynicism, right?
He mentioned as well at one point, this is Emerson, a superior mind will find themselves at odds with both ends of society. This is the extremes you're talking about earlier, that both ends of societies are the same extremes, the materialistic extreme and the moral extreme. But I would say a more superior still will find themselves at that odds, but then still know they need to belong to somewhere, because they're actually missing an ingredient of life if they don't. They're belonging is an experience of life. Isolation is as well, but we all have moments of isolation regardless. But if you become the arch skeptic, you are denying yourself any moments of belonging, and then thus kind of removing yourself from an experience.
Yeah,
that makes your skepticism less fulfilling, I think.
I think if we can go from this to how Emerson is sort of dropping the skepticism at the end. Emerson has this tendency of just completely giving you the positive version of something, and then at the end saying, okay, now I'm going to tell you why maybe you shouldn't do this, or maybe you should just do it temporarily. It's kind of like, you should do this, you should do it, you should follow it, but just make sure it doesn't last forever. Because in Emerson's words, you should be a skeptic for a time, and he actually says, even if you don't want to be a skeptic, you're still going to be at a point in your life where you're going to be just like that guy, say, why am I doing this, or where am I going? And you're going to actually say that about what you believe as well, or what beliefs.
He seemed to believe as well. He seemed to believe as well that he was living or entering a time that man could not but experience the skeptical, where he says the philosophy we want is one of fluxions and mobility. The Spartan and Stoic schemes are too stark and stiff for our occasion. So he seems to believe that it's sort of in the milieu, it's in the air, that man will now experience these moments, these skeptical moments from now on, rather than a Spartan who would never have been able to have, would have been able to go through his entire life without them. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to note that. I thought it was an interesting line.
Yeah. So in that sense, he is saying you should do it temporarily, just like I mentioned, and that it should lead, the skepticism only exists, and he mentions this, I don't have a exact quote, but he says that skepticism exists so you can, stumble on or just find a new way of expression, a new way of thinking. It should lead a new way of thinking, which will drive forward progress or your personal progress. It shouldn't exist just because, the world doesn't make sense and you should just question it eternally. And he gives a wonderful little quote about what would happen if you just stayed in skepticism forever. For instance, he says, hold on. In first, he's talking about the need for, the use of skepticism in this quote. He says, we are natural believers. We mentioned this quote before. We are natural believers. Truth, or the connection between cause and effect, alone interests us. We are persuaded that a thread runs through all things. All worlds are strung on it, as beads, and men, and events, and life come to us only because of that thread. They pass and repass only that we may know the direction and continuity of that line. A book or statement which goes to show that there is no line, but random and chaos, a calamity out of nothing, a prosperity, and no account of it, a hero born from a fool from a hero, dispirits us. Seen or unseen, we believe the tie exists. Talent make counterfeit ties. And this is the part that's most important for me. Talent makes counterfeit ties. Genius finds the real ones. So sort of, he mentioned talent as relating to sensation back when we first began this essay. And now he's saying that talent can create counterfeit ties that will make you believe a certain way that's not,
like a magician's trick, almost.
Yeah,
it's the trick of the hands. Other sorts of talents can make you believe other sorts of ties.
But a genius that's
illusory.
Sort of, a genius that is, in my opinion, what Emerson shows as genius is someone who's this self-reliant person he talks about in his essay, Self-Reliance, which is someone who has individualized his thought so much that he has gone back to being one with the world in this pantheist sense. That's always present in Emerson's writing, that if you individualize your thought and if you believe only what you are yourself believe, then you can actually be in harmony with nature once again. And he is saying that the genius, someone who went through this sort of line of skepticism towards finding what he actually believes in, finding belief, finding faith. He even mentions faith, I believe, in one point, just finding faith. They can find the real ones and just leave what counterfeit ties that have been created to ensnare him, such as. And he is now talking about why you shouldn't stay in skepticism, because then you start just denying everything. And denying everything in itself is not a valid point of view. He says, there is a painful rumor in circulation that if you have been practiced upon in all the principal performances of life, this sort of notion of everything is just illusion, sort of postmodernist thought of everything is a construct. We have been practiced upon in all the principal performances of life, and free agency is the emptiest name. We have been sopped and drugged with the air, with food, with woman, with children, with sciences, with events, which leave us exactly where they found us. The mathematics, 'tis complained, leave the mind where they find it. So do all sciences, and so do all events and actions. I find a man who has passed through all the sciences, the churl he was, and through all the offices, learned, civil and social, can detect the child. We are not the less necessitated to dedicate life to them. In fact, we may come to accept as the fixed rule and theory of our state of education that God is a substance and his method is illusion. So in this sense, he starts the paragraph by talking about how everything is an illusion and everything's a construct. But then it says, if you go from that line of thought, you can just say, God is a substance and his methods are illusion. So in that sense, even if it is illusion, it is substance in the sense that that's the only thing that you know. It's the only thing that exists. If you even go through that whole postmodernist construct path, you will still have to go back into reality and the sensations that you have to live with, because that's the only thing there is. And at the end, it's just, everything becomes an illusion, in which case the word illusion becomes meaningless. So he's talking about, the end point of skepticism in the end doesn't lead to anywhere.
The techies have their own version of this as well, don't they? With the belief that we're in a simulation, we're in a computerized simulation. But it's the same, like, everything I'm experiencing must be some form of illusion.
So it's pointless to even think about as a legit philosophy. Like, what are you going to get from there? Everything is an illusion.
Well, it ties in with their whole world being, because their whole world is about computers and software. So if they can then...
And at some point they're going to...
It might be a handy metaphor for them, but it doesn't mean it's any more true than Emerson's pantheistic take or naturalist take, for instance.
Yeah, at some point they're going to plug themselves to a computer and live forever, in their opinion.
I'm not sure about that one. I suppose there's one other piece I don't think we've dealt with that I want to talk with. Is there any other piece you think is missing? It was this, we mentioned it briefly before we came on air. This line that Emerson states that we are natural believers. And that, for me, meant that, I'll just try to find it here. We are natural believers. Truth, where the connection between cause and effect alone interests us. We are persuaded that a thread runs through all things. All worlds are strung on it as beads, and men and events and life come to us only because of that thread. They pass and repass only that we may know the direction and the continuity of that line. And this jarred with the skeptic, because Emerson himself is a naturalist, and I was there thinking, if we're natural believers, then the pragmatist, or the person who goes through his day, through his life on a sort of day-to-day, I'm just getting this job done, this task done, without the great intellectual sitting back looking at it, he's going to be a believer, because he's going to fall into what is natural. And then that led me to think this whole idea that the skeptic and the layman are not things that should be overlapping. It's a reserve for people who have time and freedom and an estate like Montaigne, and in that sense, it kind of is a privilege. But that doesn't mean I give out to Montaigne for having it. It's not one of these like revocable privileges sort of things. But you do have to recognize that it is. That's not something that's ubiquitous.
Montaigne's white privilege.
He's such a white old man, isn't he? But it's not something that is universal to man, or should be, even necessarily. And in that, you can kind of see a little twig between Emerson and Carlyle, where Carlyle has those Calvinist beliefs. You go out and do your work. We talked about this when we're going through past and present, that every man sort of had this job to do, this work to do. And if you did that, you naturally fell into these pockets of belief and conviction, rather than you didn't naturally become a skeptic if you were doing that sort of thing. So I thought that was a nice tie-in.
You didn't just think your way into the religion in Carlyle's view. You worked towards that. You just you did it either through sweat of your hands or through sweat of your brain, just like he says. So Carlyle has a much more like set belief towards that. Emerson started entertaining both worlds, both like thinker and although he doesn't have great views of the thinker, he attacks them at certain points of in this essay alone, not to mention other essays where he attacks just simple thinkers that think they're above it all. But the whole privilege thing, I made my point of that clear. I think that Emerson, in this view, he thinks that, skepticism is something you have to go through even if you don't want it. But, you should think of skepticism as going towards your actual beliefs. And I wouldn't think that Emerson would sort of differentiate it between the person of means and the person like a peasant, which might have something to do with how Emerson himself viewed peasants. We talked about that before, but Emerson was a kind of an elite person, and he wouldn't be able to, I think, relate to a peasant as well as he might have thought. Just like I mentioned, there was a point where he gave like this big speech to a bunch of unlearned people, just like an essay or a lecture that he did. And they remarked that everybody was in high spirits, even though they didn't understand a word of what he said. So in this, that whole quote was there to like talk about how upbeat Emerson is, not to like say that he looked down upon the peasantry, but it kind of gives that impression as well. Anyhow,
but there is a natural disconnect. I don't think we should blame him for that. That's just the way the class system, naturally made itself in those times. But he was trying to reach them. He was trying to give a performance anyway. But I can agree with that. I don't know if there's any other closing remarks you have. I think that's
we can
a good way to close
on the very last paragraph of
Emerson, I had that highlighted as well. I'll give it to you.
No, I've been reading too many quotes. I think
okay,
you can close it with
the very last one, just the two-liner. Yeah, that's what I had.
Yeah.
Let a man learn to look for the permanent in the mutable and fleeting. Let him learn to bear the disappearance of things he has wont to reverence, without losing his reverence. Let him learn that he is here, not to work, but to be worked upon, and that, though abyss open under abyss, and opinion displace opinion, all are at last contained in the eternal cause. If my bark sink, 'tis to another sea. And we'll be back next time on Shakespeare, I believe.
Yep, we're gonna go through Shakespeare, both in Carlisle,
both Emerson,
and in
both Emerson and Carlisle. Should be interesting. All right, guys.
Yep.
See you then.
Right. See ya.